My apologies, it's a bit precarious up here. Thank you, Lorraine. As our first panel assembles on stage, I'm inviting them to join us here. I'd like to just introduce them and the topic they're going to be discussing, higher, faster, further to the flight. So please come on up. Mike Hirschberg is with us, Executive Director of American Helicopter Society International. Colonel Doug Hooks, Systems Division Chief for HQDA. Richard Kretzmar, Project Manager for Improved Turbine Engine Future Vertical Lift at U.S. Army PEO Aviation. And today's panel will be moderated by Marcus Weisgerber, our Global Business Editor at Defense One. Marcus, it's all yours.
Thanks, Daniela. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out early this morning. I made a joke that it's already lunchtime in the Army, so maybe early for some of us, like myself. So I'm the Global Business Editor at Defense One. I write a lot about acquisition, about budget, and about defense firms. So one of the things I love are helicopters, and this is actually real exciting. I was telling the panelists I got to fly in an F-15 a few weeks ago, but which was very exciting in its own right, but I really do enjoy helicopters and have gotten to fly in a lot of military ones over the years. So our panelists, as Daniela mentioned, I have next to me Rich Kretschmar. He's the president, the program manager, for the Improved Turbine Engine, which is the new engine, more powerful engine being made for developed for the Black Hawk and the Apache, and he's also in charge of the Future Vertical Lift program, which is essentially the Army helicopters of the future. We got Colonel Doug Hooks next to him. He's the System Division Chief for Army Aviation and Aircraft Systems, and he works with the Army staff to establish priorities for developing and fielding and funding all Army aviation, rotary, and fixed-wing aircraft. So everything's in your portfolio, I guess. And at the end, Mike Hirschberg, the director of the American Helicopter Society, 20-plus years in the aerospace and defense industry, supporting DARPA, ONR, and you even worked on the F-35 program back in the 90s in the prototyping phase, so really neat. So I want to open with a quick little story about the first time I flew in a helicopter, and it was about 10 years ago, and it was a CH-46 Sea-Knight, and it was a cold April morning, and we flew from the Pentagon. We were going to make a quick hop down to Quantico to go see the V-22, which was about to deploy for the first time to Iraq. And the Marines wanted to show us that the capability had increased a lot since the 46, and that day was horrible. It was about 40-mile-an-hour winds and then gusts over 50 miles an hour. And they flew us down in the Sea-Knights, hovered around for a little bit because we got there a little early, and then showed us that the V-22 could fly a lot faster and do a lot of things that the Sea-Knight couldn't do. And they were successful in that. The majority of the press who came along on the trip were unable to hold down any of the food they probably had for the previous few days. So anyway, that's, I feel, a good way to transition how the Osprey is kind of transformational for the Marine Corps, and talk about how these helicopters you're working on will be very transformational, I guess, for the Army. So I guess we'll start, Rich. Just give us bring us up to speed a little bit on the two mammoth programs you oversee, both the Improved Turbine Engine and FVL, kind of what you have coming up in the current year as benchmarks.
Happy to do that, Marcus. So just to refresh everybody's memory on the two programs, Improved Turbine Engine program is intended to provide a new power plant for the fleet of helicopters in the medium class. So we have both the Blackhawks and the Apaches that are currently powered by the 701 series engine made by GE. And over the last decade or so, we've asked those helicopters to do more and more, put more equipment on there, and we've operated them in environments that we hadn't had to operate them in before. And so we ended up with a capability gap. And so we went to industry and said, okay, guys, we need 50% more power in that same weight and volume constraint that you've given us with the 701 series. And to give you a metric on what that means, over the 30-plus years that we've been using that 700 series engine from GE, they've improved the power 25%. And so now we've asked the industry to step up and give 50% more power than that in that same weight and volume constraint in order to keep the Apaches and Blackhawks relevant from a worldwide performance perspective. And oh, by the way, we also want you guys to make it 25% more fuel efficient. We want it to be much more reliable than the current engines and more durable so that our sustainment costs go down. and we want it more affordable. And so it was kind of a tall order that we requested of industry. And we had a science and technology program called the AIT program that was run out of the AMRDEC, Aviation Missile Research Development Engineering Center is that acronym. And so they delivered on that, and industry demonstrated that they can, in fact, deliver that type of performance in that volume and weight constraint. So enter the Improved Turbine Engine program. Now what we've asked industry to do is, okay, we love that you guys demonstrated that. Now we want you to engineer that into a system that we can then hang on the aircraft that will last 6,000 hours instead of the couple hundred hours that you demonstrated in the test cell, and make it so that it can be produced. And so we were given the authority by the Defense Acquisition Executive last summer that it's an Army-led program now, and we've made the most of that responsibility in that we have achieved all our milestones. We had a Milestone A decision from the Army Acquisition Executive in June. Ms. McFarland gave us permission to enter the TMRR phase, or we're calling it the preliminary design phase of the program. And we awarded 2 contracts, one to GE and one to ATEC, which is a joint venture between Honeywell and Pratt & Whitney. And it was full and open competition, so those 2 vendors were successful. We're off and running now in the program. They've got 18 to 24 months to deliver preliminary design of their engine, and from those preliminary designs and whatever other information they can bring to the table to convince us that they're the right solution for our problem, we're going to down select to a single vendor at Milestone B in the 2019 timeframe, and then to the EMD with production intended to be in 2024. We're looking to accelerate the programs. We have opportunities that, if resources are available, we'll ask industry to accelerate as best they can and provide that capability to the warfighter that much quicker. The other program, Future Vertical Lift, I'm also honored to be the first PM for that. We have this really compelling name. It's called Capability Set 3, which means very little to anybody that's not intimate with the program. But it is a very important program because it's the first program that we've rolled out of the Future Vertical Lift initiative. The Army's the lead service. We had a material development decision by Mr. Kendall in October, and he gave us authority to move into the material solutions analysis phase of the program. And the big effort in that phase is the analysis of alternatives. So we're working with the Marine Corps and the SOCOM community with the Army as the lead, and we're going to validate our requirements. We spent a lot of time getting our arms around the requirements for these different capability sets. We have a pretty good idea of what we want. In this particular capability set, we're looking at the Army utility mission, the Marine Corps attack and utility mission, and the SOCOM deep attack penetration mission. And so the challenge we have is, can we take those requirements and convince ourselves that we can go after and meet those requirements with an airframe that's relatively common. And commonality has a lot of different terms, but we're going to marry that up with what technology maturation is currently, or will be in the 2018 timeframe, and then move on into the Milestone A phase of the program. Right now it's scheduled for 2019, and then we'll select some number of vendors. We're still working on the acquisition strategy. We've resourced a specific acquisition strategy, but we're looking at tailoring that based on the technology maturation and how that lines up with the requirements and what our confidence and risk acceptance is for an acquisition strategy going forward.
So I traveled actually last week with Deputy Secretary Work, and we went out to the Reagan Forum, and on the flight out he was talking a lot about the continuing resolution and how that is kind of hampering the threat that poses the funding measure for the government, that Congress not approving an appropriations. How does that impact you, if at all?
It definitely impacts us. The consistent funding and funding when it needs to be available is very important to a program manager. It's sort of a strange situation you find yourself in because we're being asked to accelerate, and they're looking for opportunities. The leadership is looking for opportunities to bring capability to the warfighter faster. Mm-hmm. And the mantra that I use in my office anyway is we want to move at the speed of industry. So I've challenged my group and our stakeholders that are involved in the programs to do what they can and look at their particular areas so that we can be as efficient as we can be within our government processes, so that we don't hinder the development. So when you put artificial constraints on the PMs, because of resource availability, then obviously it slows down the program. Now, fortunately on ITEP, we're not a new start. So under the rules of the CR, we have enough money to not only keep the contracts that we've been awarded moving, we have to pace ourselves, right? So we have to be cognizant of when that money runs out, given CR and how long it's going to last. There's always that uncertainty, and what we don't want to do is accelerate our partners and ask them to go as fast as they can, and then run into a situation where the CR is not over, we're out of money, and then they have to find other things for those people to do, and it disrupts their workforce. So we're working very deliberately with our partners in industry to make sure we don't do that. FVL is a slightly different animal because we are a new start. This is the first year for funding for the program on our PE line, so we have zero funding under CR. That poses a challenge in my office on doing the things that I need to do to keep the program moving forward. We're working around that, but the big activity, the analysis of alternative, they have money. The organizations that execute those activities have institutional funding so they can get started on it. So presently, we're not slowed down in that particular effort of the program. So CR is definitely an issue. The longer it lasts, the worse it is for both the programs. So we're hopeful that Congress and will figure that out sooner than later and let us get moving.
Mike, wanted to slide down to you. We've been when we talk about FVL, everyone kind of thinks of the two technologies, the Lockheed Boeing coaxial helicopter and the tilt rotor that Bell's been developing. I wanted to ask you what do you, when you think of the helicopters of the future and kind of those technologies, where do you see, what type of technologies do you see to include those or beyond those?
Sure, great. Thanks so much. And I think we have a slide. Can we bring the slide up? So, yeah. So here we go. So there are two companies that have received contracts under JMR, Joint Multi-Role Technology Demonstration, Bell and Sikorsky Boeing. And there's two other companies that are also developing technologies, AVX Aircraft and Karam Aircraft. And one of the things, actually, as you mentioned, CR, so Congress has asked to accelerate Future Vertical Lift and JMR. They've added additional funds each of the last several years for the JMR technology demonstrations. And those are actually holding up some of the additional demonstrations that AVX and Karam are hoping to do this year. So that's additional funds that some of the committees have marked, but without the final conference bill, obviously the government doesn't have funds those additional funds. So I think actually the idea of helicopters of 2030 is really not quite a misnomer, but it's really a inflection point. So today, except for the Marine Corps, everyone's got helicopters. Marines have the Osprey. I think really being able to fly on the wing, fly on a compound configuration where you're not asking the rotor to do both lift and thrust at the same time, I think it's really a transformative capability. And not just with speed, as kind of gets focused on a lot, but also in range, tremendous increases in range, payload, altitude. So I think that, some notes here. So people tend to focus on, these are the JMR, the Future Vertical Lift concepts. So Future Vertical Lift is an acquisition program. As Rich mentioned, the analysis of alternatives starts in this fiscal year, so I'm going to get that underway. But what people focus on is the JMR technology demonstrator. So the government has given some amount of funds to the four companies, Boeing and Sikorsky and Bell, and they have added hundreds of millions of dollars of their own money to make those fly. So I think that these revolutionary new capabilities from what are being explored here under JMR have real potential for the different aircraft that are being hoped for under Future Vertical Lift.
Colonel, when Mike and I actually were emailing yesterday. He equated the helicopters now to being kind of like a flip phone and moving up to a smartphone. So the question for you, I guess, then, what kind of apps or whatever would you need in that helicopter of the future? Thinking also to what the F-35 can do. Kind of, I'm thinking of it kind of like that, where it's more than just an airframe. It's the whole computer system involved with it. So I guess, what do you see there?
Well, if you move forward and you're talking applications, I think they're very similar to the characteristics we currently have out there on the airframe now. You're still going to have aircraft survivability equipment. You're still going to have sensors for degraded visual environment, weapons for lethality, manned and unmanned teaming, and you're also going to have the precision navigation and timing necessary as we move into the future. What you'll see differently, I believe, is the options that are associated with that. I mean, if you look at today, the Apache currently has right now, as a pilot, they can go out there and fly under FLIR, 2 different modes, white hot, black hot, and you can also switch to goggles if you need be. That's the lower level tier of degraded visual environment. As we move forward into the future vertical lift, imagine the possibilities of having an aircraft 360-degree sensors that not only the pilots can use, but the crew chiefs can use, and they can switch to different modes based on the degraded visual environment they're in, whether it be snow, whether it be dust, whether heavy rain, fog, and then they can see through it and ultimately own the night. That's really what I think we're moving towards in the future, and along with the aircraft survivability is just maintaining, staying ahead of what the threat is out there, to be able to detect and defeat any system that's out there in the future, and have an open architecture in the FVL to where it's simple plug and play. If you get an update and a threat, you can go in and put a new card in, and you have the system there that can detect and defeat whatever system's out there. Currently, we don't have that capability. I mean, Rich and I were talking this morning, we have to go back in, and usually if we're updating for survivability, we'll have to do a major change to the platform out there, which could take a lot of man hours and switching components out, or it could be adding additional components, wiring to the aircraft, which has increased the weight like we've done over the years, which is why ITEP's so important to us. We're buying back that capability that we lost because of all the weight we've added to the aircraft over the years.
So when thinking to the wars of the future, we constantly talk about contested environments, and we've seen the Air Force go all in with stealth and make that a big priority, fighter and bomber aircraft. What type of technology do you see on, say, a helicopter to be able to operate in those types of environments?
The same characteristics. I mean, the aircraft survivability is the key for that environment. The improved range, endurance, agility, mobility we're going to get out of these new platforms is going to be key as well. But you're going to have it's going to be a contested environment, even if you're not going to eliminate the contested environment out there in operations against a threat. So you're always going to have the survivability means. Cyber is a new one that we're going to have to really start looking for in the future. But again, the assured PNT, or precision navigation and timing, making sure that we can deny any spoofing or degraded capabilities we have on the aircraft moving forward. Those technology advances are going to be key to integrate into FVL to make sure it's successful.
Mike, I wanted to ask you about the industrial base and kind of what's your grade for the health of the helicopter industrial base. We've seen consolidation in the defense industry, and also Frank Kendall, who's the outgoing Undersecretary for Acquisition, has talked about the need to push the envelope more just in terms of technology. Are you seeing that in the vertical lift area?
So interestingly, there hasn't really been consolidation in a long time in the vertical flight industry. So it's great that Sikorsky's found a new and maybe better home with Lockheed, but all the companies, all the rotorcraft companies are really subsidiaries of big multi-billion-dollar conglomerates. So it really hasn't been the mergers that you've seen. There's obviously the acquisition. But as far as the health of the industry, if you look at the beginning of the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was about a $4 billion a year production, which then at the peak up in 2013-14, it was up close to $20 billion, and that's global military production. Obviously, with the drawdown in the two conflicts, it's projected to be about 40% reduction, so about $11 billion a year. So from a production standpoint, it's big cuts from the high at the peak. So that's been very, very painful for the industry. Similarly, unfortunately, on the commercial side, we've seen kind of the same thing where there was a huge boom in especially large, long-range, high-tech helicopters for the offshore oil industry. And that's also been dropped about 40% since the drop in oil prices over the last few years. So from a production health perspective, it's way down from where we were the peak a few years ago. But from the innovation and new concepts perspective, there's never been a brighter time with rotorcraft. I think last year there were something like 6 different new prototypes and new models that flew, and several more this year. And obviously the V280 and the SB1 will be flying next year. So there's really never been a more exciting time for rotorcraft with new technology, modern technology aircraft now being demonstrated, and hopefully many of those will go into production, and I think as more be able to fulfill the needs of the future customers, both military and civil. And I wanted to say also that as far as the health of the industry, I mean, the industry is really putting everything they can into future aircraft, including FVL. So as I mentioned before, industry government is providing hundreds of millions of dollars, but the industry probably combined for FVL, JMR, and other, besides just the CapeSat 3, it's probably putting in $1 billion over the next several years. So industry is really leaning forward to make this happen, and that's despite the cuts in the production. So obviously that funds the research and development, a lot of it. So having a healthy production base and hopefully with alleviating sequestration, some of the other cuts to defense, I think the industry will be better poised to respond in the future.
Mm-hmm. Rich, pivot back to you. As I mentioned, I was out at the Reagan Forum over the weekend, and a lot of senior military officials were talking about accelerating. And you've touched on this a little bit, but I was hoping you could get a little deeper. Is it possible to accelerate? Is it a matter of just needing more money, or for both of these programs, is the pace kind of deliberate?
So we when we pace a program, there's a couple considerations. Certainly resourcing is important because you have to fund the acquisition strategy that you choose to pursue and how many vendors you choose to take through the different phases of the program. And availability of the resources in the portfolio are certainly a driver on the timing of the capability sets. However, there's also the risk tolerance, and understanding the speed of technology maturation and how that lines up with the requirements that you're asking for. And so when you look at a program like JMR, and I think we sometimes confuse ourselves that JMR is in fact FVL. It's not. It's a demonstration program. It's much broader, much more general to mature critical technologies that are applicable across all of the rotary wing capabilities. And when you look at the nuances of the program, you'll see a lot of that. You'll see things that are specific to a given capability set. You'll see technologies that are more broad that can be applied to the different capability sets. And so what we do is we look at that and see what the timing of those programs are and then what we expect to get out of that from an acquisition perspective. And so it's important, from my perspective, to make sure that we take advantage of the investment that have been made and leverage as a taxpayer and as a program manager. It's important to me to leverage the industry investments, to leverage the Army and other service investments in that technology maturation. And we can do that in a lot of different ways. And one is to be consistent about our requirements. So when we ask industry to do something in a technology demonstration program, we're typically pretty good about, Colonel Hooks and his counterparts that are looking into the future and trying to decide what we need and how we're going to fight in the future. They don't do that haphazardly. They're very deliberate about it. They're trying to, polish their crystal ball and see what the future is going to hold. And so it is, to the degree that we can be consistent on those requirements, we position ourselves to better leverage that investment. And not only from S&T, but as the programs move forward. So as I go through the different phases of the program, as long as I'm consistent in asking industry what to do, then we continue to leverage that. And so that's very important. So, absolutely, to get back to your long-winded answer here, but to get back to your original point, yes, I think we could accelerate the program. I think industry is chomping at the bit to accelerate the program, but we have to balance all those pieces, and we have to say, we as the government are willing to accept this level of risk. We as the government have these resources available, and then industry can provide this capability, and those three things come together and lay out a program plan for us.
I can imagine if you accelerate FVL so much, that then could threaten ITEP, right?
So they're sort of decoupled. I get that question a lot, actually, and so ITEP is specifically intended to provide the capability for the Blackhawks and the Apaches, which are very, very good aircraft, and they have delivered in spades for the capability that the Army has asked them to do. In fact, they've delivered to the point where we're having to continually upgrade them. We've gotten very good at modernizing those aircraft, and industry has gotten very good at modernizing the aircraft, because that's a strategy that we've had for the last 15 years. And so the requirements that we have for the ITEP engine are specific to those two platforms and the capability we need out of those two platforms. However, when you look at the capability sets going forward, there are certain capability sets that lend themselves to that class of engine. The capability set 1 and potentially 2 are sized based on the missions that they're being asked to execute to accept an ITEP or some variation of an ITEP engine. Capability sets 3 and above, are asking for a little bit more horsepower than ITEP is intended to deliver, even in a growth perspective. But the technologies that are being developed under ITEP and some of the other programs that are related to engine development, like ACE and FATE, out of the MRDEC, those technologies can be brought to bear on existing centerline engines. Things like 3D aerodynamics and additive manufacturing to make the weight lower, open the design space. Sand ingestion technology, or that's the wrong way, keep sand from getting in the engine technology. Those things can all be brought to bear on larger engines, and that technology and that capability has been matured under ITEP. So I don't think that accelerating FVL is going to impact the need for the ITEP engine, because even if we produce the capability set 3 aircrafts at a fairly aggressive rate, we would still have Blackhawks and Apaches in our fleet for 20, 30 plus more years. And so, if we don't think that they are, we've identified a capability gap currently on those platforms. That capability gap isn't going to get smaller in the next 20, 30 years. And so ITEP will continue to be a valuable program for those platforms, and that's why it's one of the highest priority programs in aviation.
Okay. We're going to move to the audience for Q&A in just one moment, but I just wanted to ask Colonel Hooks real quick to talk about what is being done with these new technologies and programs that you have to ensure that there is joint applicability across the services.
Okay, so as Rich discussed earlier, we're moving forward on CAPESAT 3 to the analysis of alternatives, and the Marines, SOCOM, and Army interest in that. Prior to that, we made sure that each of the service, their requirements, their specific requirements, they were going to bring to the table. We're going to go into the AOA and inform the AOA analysis of alternatives to ensure that those requirements could be met. Outside of that, we continue to have discussions on the joint level and OSD level with all the services involved as we continue to move forward. Right now, it's dealing with CAPESAT 3. As we move forward later down the road and go into another CAPESAT, The appropriate services will be involved in discussions on that, moving forward in the same manner, determining who lead service will be in that one, and then making sure all the requirements from the other services are met. So yes, I would say discussions are going on very well right now between the services, and moving forward. Yeah.
Move to the audience. Questions? I think we have a microphone that's going to come right at you. Just please identify yourself.
Yeah, Dave Wiles from Textron. The question has to do with FVL oversight and kind of the current construct of the FVL Executive Steering Group, ESG. And so with the decision of the MDD decision in October, are you going to keep, are you envisioning that you're going to keep that same construct for program oversight essentially at the joint and OSD level, or will there be some change in the ESG construct?
So, you want me to take it?
Oh, I can take it if you want. It doesn't matter.
Let me start, and then
Okay.
you can, if I miss anything.
All right.
So the FEL initiative, which is the executive steering group you're referring to, and there's a council of colonels underneath that. That initiative is going to go on. Colonel Hooks is actually the chair of the council of colonels there. So, but it's intended to focus on that family of systems and all the capability sets. It's not intended to provide acquisition oversight or any decision authority for the program of record. So the CAPESAT 3 FEL program has been delegated to the Army, or not delegated, it's still an OSD program, but the Army is the lead acquisition agency for that program. So I have an acquisition chain of command that you're all familiar with, PEO, Army Acquisition Executive, Mr. Kendall, or the OSD DAE. And so that's the acquisition oversight for the program. Now, coupled with that, in order to make sure that we are servicing the various service equities, we have established a GOSC, a small group of 3-star level men and women that have the resource and the requirement decision authority for the different participants in that capability set. And they'll be brought into the discussion as needed to adjudicate any discrepancies in the requirements or resources. So if, for example, resources get traded away and some requirements have to be adjusted, that body of men and women will be the authorities to make those adjudication decisions. So we will continue to report into the ESG for situational awareness, but they are not in an oversight role currently on the FEL program.
So yes, and to add to what Rich said, so in the current process, after the analysis of alternatives, it would come back into the building, go through the Army side to the AROC to the chief. Prior to that, since it is a joint, since it has Marine equities and SOCOM equities, those 3 personnel, which there's going to be a GOS between Army, Marines, and SOCOM prior to the AROC, that will determine if there's any trade space needed, whether we can meet in the middle and move forward as one group on a single platform. If it cannot be, then it will be identified at that point in time prior to the AROC and say we just can't get there, and then we figure out where to go from there. So that's the additional piece we've put in there to ensure that each service requirements are met, with the Army being the lead agency on this one. We got to make sure the Marines and SOCOM interests are met, and if they can't be, it's at least brought up and determined prior to going back to the Chief of Staff of the Army before we continue to move forward. Doesn't mean it's going to hold it up. It can still move forward. It can move in multiple paths. It can still go on the same path. But it's an extra check and balance, if you will, we put in there to make sure that all the equities are met.
James.
Yeah, hi, James Drew from Aviation Week. Could I ask you about the ACE engine specifically? So we've got FATE, and then we have ITEP, and now we have the new one, which is ACE, the variable speed turbine. Could you explain the importance of that engine, and do you think the Army can afford to support that engine while also supporting these other 2?
So I'm probably the guy to answer this. I'm not intimately familiar with ACE. I know the general aspects of what they're trying to do, particularly the variable speed piece of it. So again, it's in the S&T realm. It's intended to mature a certain type of technology that could be brought to bear on future programs. There is no current plans to follow that program with a program of record. However, I think that given the requirements associated with FVL and some of the platform designs that are coming out and their need for efficiencies in either transmissions or engines in order to achieve their requirements, that technology, when matured, will be looked at very deliberately by the engine vendors and the platform vendors to be brought into their programs. It is important because I think that variable speed is the next step. That coupled with combined platform and engine control. I think when I've talked very detailed with both the engine vendors and the platform developers on what the next, what's our next opportunity to get efficiencies out of the engines, and how do we develop a strategy to allow industry to find those synergies. And the variable speed and that combined platform engine control seems to be where they're headed.
At what point will you draw the line and say, at what point will you draw the line and say, we have our weight requirements and our requirements for the aircraft, now go find an engine to power that size vehicle? Do you know when that might happen?
Yes. We have to, in order for us to go out with a request for proposal, in the next phase, we have to be able to clearly articulate to industry what we want them to produce. And so, we're trying to have a Milestone A decision in 2019. And then we will have the RFP shortly thereafter, and the source selection and contract awards in the 2021 timeframe. And so our system specification has to be written to a level of fidelity that industry can design to in that timeframe. And so that's part of the decomposition in our system engineering approach that we have ongoing now. We have draft CDDs that are being written by the requirements community. My folks are working very deliberately with them to decompose those requirements, make sure they're not underspecified or overspecified, and turn that into a spec that we can hand industry. So, in the 19-20 timeframe, I would guess we'd be able to lock down those requirements and say, here's what we want out of this capability set.
And
Mike, you have something to add?
Yep. And James, if I could answer that as well. So there's a common confusion between the S&T world and the acquisition world. So as Rich nicely said, ACE is a science and technology program, and the company that won that, ATEC, the joint venture between Honeywell and Pratt & Whitney, ACE is to develop or demonstrate advanced concept engines. So it's specifically looking at a variable power turbine. Pretty much all of these advanced configurations that we're looking at need much wider RPM range for the rotors. So that demonstrating that power turbine, and GE, which has the Fate engine, and the two companies are competing for ITEP. GE's also been looking at variable speed turbines, and those technologies then are intended to be scaled to whatever size the future vertical lift, the different classes. And I do want to also mention along those lines that future vertical lift is 5 different capability sets. So the demonstrators are focused towards sort of that medium class, but there's going to be everything from CapeSat 1, the small ones, all the way up to CapeSat 5s, the large ones. So there's a kind of sometimes a confusion that there's like a winner take all for the platforms, and that's absolutely not the case. The government intends to continue as much competition for the different the capability sets. So just because somebody has a great flight demonstration in the JMR program, it doesn't mean that they're going to have the lock on every rotorcraft program in the future. And the same with the engines. You're going to need a broad capability of sizes and power classes throughout for each of these systems, and also for the existing fleet, the Apaches and Blackhawks, which really probably will be flying beyond 2050. So it's important to keep those capable for decades to come.
Questions? To the microphone.
Hi, Kathleen Delano, CEO of PMIC Incorporated. Thank you very much, and thank you for your service. To the point of S&T, we have all heard Secretary Carter use the word innovation, I think, more times than any one person has ever used that word. And we have to balance rapid capability with the need for that fundamental basic research and applied research that we see across DoD labs. So my question is really for Mike and the entire panel, what is happening to bring in those folks at the labs who are doing maybe some of the earlier stage innovation to apply perhaps to future force and maybe retrofit? Is there a consideration of integrating some of the DoD lab work to have a voice at that so that the warfighter needs and the lab output are more closely aligned?
So I'll start by saying, the labs absolutely do provide a critical technology development capability, especially with tools, materials, all kinds of different innovations. And those feed into the tech base. I know, for instance, Army Research Lab works with NASA, the Aviation Development Directorate for the Army. So that's a very good feed for the pipeline. Certainly, Aviation Development Directorate, ADD, which used to be composed of the folks at Ames in California and Fort Eustis, have a lot of these tech programs, mentioned ITEP and others. So they certainly provide a vital role. And I mean, the whole JMR is an S&T program, and the predecessor to ITEP was an S&T program. So absolutely, the tech base is critical, and it's been somewhat underfunded over the years, but I think it still has really punched above its weight in contributions to the warfighter.
So I'd like to take a shot at that too. So one of the interesting things that they've done in the vertical lift community was the initiative. And it's been going on since 2009-ish, quite a long time. And we typically think of that as a requirements effort because I think the lion's share of the work has been done by the men and women that got their arms around the requirements that we're going to have in the future and bend those requirements into the different CAPE sets. However, when you look at that organization, there's different IPTs, and one of those is the Science and Technology IPT. And they're deliberately part of that body because then they can work with the requirements community and say, okay, that's here's the state of the art, here's the art of the possible, and in order to get after that requirement, we need some innovation. We can't get there from here with the current technology. And so that communication and that interaction between those communities, I think, has been done very, very well in the vertical lift community, and we're starting to reap the benefits of that. In fact, the JMR program, when you talk to Dan Bailey, who's been running that program for quite a bit of time and doing a wonderful job, he deliberately takes that information out of that initiative, and that helps him craft his S&T strategy. And then me and my counterparts that are doing the PM activities can then pull from that. And industry, in fact, is informed as well, right? So with the Vertical Lift Consortium, our communications are very transparent on what we're looking for in the future, what technologies we think we need, what we think are critical. They can put their resources toward that and then be much more competitive with their core competencies in delivering it to the vendors and to government in order for us to get after those requirements. So I think that is probably one of the key things in this community that's allowed us to be successful to date.
Good time for about one more, sir.
My question is for all the panelists. 40, 50 years ago, when I entered the program, all of our programs were required by OSD, of course, in the Congress, to be considered for tri-service, number one, triple service funding, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and of course also international in the joint arena. Many of those programs came to light. As a matter of fact, the first operational fighter bomber we had, of course, was the Harrier out of England. And of course, there were a lot of international cooperation. I'm sure that you still are doing that, but probably at a subliminal level. But the cost of development of new systems today, are we ignoring the things that Augusta is doing, that Airbus is doing, and others, As a matter of fact, in the U.S. today, probably have almost as many Eurocopters as we do in the commercial world, which I'm now in, by the way. Over half of our helicopters that we operate are Eurocopters vis-a-vis Bell and others. So could you offer comments about, are each of your staffs perhaps coordinating with the NATO allies? Are we, in fact, do we have any funds from them? And what's the OSD opinion? Because that's a policy statement from the National Command Authority.
Well, this is more your lane right now, so.
So we're certainly not ignoring any of the international industry partners and the capabilities that they bring to bear. And so Mike attempted to say it earlier that, you know, the pictures that you saw up here, the JMR participants, those aren't the FVL competitors. We're not down selecting from those 4 guys to get an FVL program. You know, so the RFP that we will send out when it's time to do that will be for full and open competition, including the industry partners or international partners. We have a lot of activity going on right now with the DASADEC folks for co-development of aircraft. So Australians, the UK, the Netherlands are all countries that have weighed in on FVL and are trying to understand where the U.S. services are going with those requirements to see if they line up. Now, I think that's very important because when you look at how we sell aircraft around the world, you know, the degree that we can line up requirements early makes that much more easier to provide that capability in the future. So absolutely, we're looking internationally. As far as resource sharing to date, we're not resource sharing anything beyond the services that Colonel Hooks mentioned earlier, Marine Corps, Army, and SOCOM on this particular capability set. But we certainly have a lot of venues to communicate what we're doing and where we're going so that that potential is open in the future.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.